In this lesson, we're going to take a look at section and article elements, and you won't be penalized if this is confusing to you. To be honest, people who have studied it still have trouble figuring out when would I use the article and when would I use the section element. So let me see if I can decipher some of this for you. First, we're going to visit the spec. This should always be your first spot when you're trying to decipher some of these new HTML tags. And we can go to whatwg.org. And we can see right here, the section element represents a generic section of a document or application. A section in this context is a thematic group of content, typically with a heading. Okay, so that would make sense then, maybe. If we scroll down, we have this footer area, and this is where we're going to have maybe 4 columns. And you've seen this with lots of portfolios, where you have a list of tweets, some recent posts, categories, maybe some contact information. So it makes sense that when you're using the section element, there should always be a heading associated with it. And this is helpful because when you use a section, there is a distinct connection between the heading and the content that follows it. Otherwise, there really isn't. So maybe the easiest way to understand the section element is by what you would normally be familiar with, maybe sections of a newspaper. So you have a sports section, you have an entertainment section. Each of those, if you were to translate that to the web, would be placed within their own sections because they have their own related heading and thematically related content. If I scroll up, here's another situation when we could use a section. So we have a blog posting, we'll get to all of that, but then maybe below on the page, you have a few excerpts of maybe a book you're working on. This is where you could use a section element. And it's important to note that the section should not be used for styling purposes. So if you need to wrap it within a section for the sole purpose of styling it, then you're not doing it correctly. In that case, you would want to use a div. But here, a section makes perfect sense. So I will wrap each one, and pardon the mess, I'll fix this shortly. So now, notice that we're using these section elements. We're not relying on them because we need to style anything specifically. We're doing it because it creates separation and it creates a connection between the heading within and the content. It is section chapter 1. This section is chapter 2, and this section is chapter 3. Now also, we can use heading 1 tags. If I return back to the spec and I scroll down just a bit, you'll see right here, notice how the use of section means that the author can use H1 elements throughout without having to worry about whether a particular section is at the top level. And that's because when the section is included, its heading will be interpreted as the next level down of its parent heading. So yeah, that's definitely confusing. But it makes a little more sense if you think about it. We use things like outlines, a paper outline, to compare to how we would do it on the web. So if you had an outline, you would have the top level, and that would be maybe what your assignment is for. And then you would have headings below it that would represent what you're going to speak about. But the problem is that doesn't 100% convert over to the web because lots of times we're pulling in content where we don't really have control over the headings. So maybe you're pulling in a list of Facebook status messages or pulling in some tweets, and that heading has already been predefined and you cannot change it because you're dynamically pulling that in. So that can kind of muddy up the web a little bit. So the section can help solve this because if you wrap the content within a section element, then you can use the H1 and that will automatically represent a specific level in the hierarchy. So with that in mind, I could then select these H3s and switch them over to H1s. So this brings in a new question though, is if we have all of these H1s, how can we style them independently of maybe the H1s of our top level page? We don't want them possibly to be the exact same as within here. So within your CSS file, you could have situations where you have section H1, potentially section H1. This can get really confusing and will muddy up your style sheets. One thing a lot of people do, if you come into this situation where you need to style this differently, remember, you should not use the section for that purpose. So what we could do though is you could apply a class to these sections, and that way you can target them easier. You'll see in some books, I believe Jeremy Keith recommends you do things like alpha, omega, beta, Zeta, while others recommend just keep it simple and do class equals H1 or something like that. And that way, within your style sheet, you can target these specifically without having to muddy up your style sheets. Okay, let's scroll up just a bit, and now we come to this section. And this would obviously be maybe a blog, and you have a blog posting, you wrap it within a div with the class of article. Here's our title, we have some meta information, and then the posting, which I've of course shortened. So with HTML5, we can improve this a good bit. Rather than using div class equals article, we're going to use the article element. Now, it does not only refer to a blog posting, and this is kind of what I thought when I first learned about it. Really, the idea behind the article element is that it should represent content that could potentially be syndicated. And by syndicated, I mean reproduced across the web, maybe via an RSS feed. So what you can think of is your blog postings could always be syndicated, so you will want to wrap those within articles. But then also think of things like comments. Each comment could be syndicated as well, because you could have an RSS feed for the comments. So in those cases, you would also want to wrap each comment within an article as well. So always don't take these at face value. Don't immediately assume, okay, the article element is for the article of my blog posting or the news item. There's many different uses for them. Next, within the article, because we do have some information for the header, we could wrap that within a header tag as well, like so. Next, if you had maybe social networking links to share the posting, you could either put that, depending upon the situation, you could put that within a footer, or I might be more inclined to place that within an aside element. And we'll take a look at the aside tag in the next lesson. So if we scroll back down, I want you to take a look what we have here within the footer. Whether or not we would use section elements or article elements comes down to a few things. One, will this content have a heading associated with it? So if it will, lots of times you can get away with using a section, because that's the idea behind a section. It's thematically related content. Two, if the only purpose for wrapping your content within a tag at all is for styling purposes, then that is exactly what the div is for. So never use a section with the intention of, I'm going to wrap it within a section so I can style this. No, you would probably want to use a div tag for that. You would only use section, as I noted here, when really the styling isn't the issue, it's separating the content. So in this case with the footer, honestly, it's okay to keep it with a div. In my situation, I might use a section, I might not. Again, it just depends on how I intend to use this content. Now, will this be syndicated? Maybe. You could syndicate this section, so maybe you could use an article there. And this is what you're going to find is we're all still trying to figure out when the ideal times are to use an article or a div or a section. So don't feel bad if you struggle with it. I struggle with it too myself, if I'm honest. But for now, let's keep it as a div, because I want you to remember, just because you're with HTML5 doesn't mean you're never using a div again. A div absolutely has a purpose. Many times, it's just more for positioning and styling's sake, and when there's not a better tag for the job. Okay, and that's going to do it for this episode. In the next lesson, I'm going to teach you about aside tags.